Goodness.
Welcome, everyone. We're just going to take a couple of seconds to let people get connected. We had a lot of registrations, so I want to give people a chance to log on. So we appreciate your patience. You're welcome to share in the chat, your name and where you're from, if you feel comfortable doing that.
I see some familiar faces. Wow. Roberta, Annie. Let's see who else I know. God, people are from everywhere. I once got stuck in Lalich, Kentucky. It's the first flight I ever took, and we got grounded. And I sat on the plane and played poker with the men sitting next to me. And they kept wondering why I kept winning, but they didn't know that my daddy was a bookie and a gambler, and he taught me how to play cards. So
Wow, we even have some people from Nigeria. Oh,
wow.
It's amazing. Yeah, people are still logging on, so I'm just gonna take another couple seconds. Okay. I think I'll start with the introduction and I'll just keep an eye on the waiting room. If that's okay with you.
No, it's fine with
Okay, great. So welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. My name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the interim director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. And I just want to open with a land acknowledgement. The Interfaith Center at Miami University is located within the traditional homelands of the Miami and Shawnee people. The Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. We encourage you to support the work of the Miami Center at Miami University, dedicated to the revitalization of Miami language and culture and to restoring that knowledge to the Miami people. In the service of interreligious dialogue, I think it's important for us to make clear distinctions between the protection of deeply held religious and spiritual beliefs, which shape our understanding of the world in meaningful ways that promote altruistic justice, and to distinguish this from the ways in which religion has often historically been used to either cause or perpetuate harm, be that direct or systemic. So we're very pleased to welcome back Dr. Yanya Lalich here with us today. Dr. Lalich is a professor emerita of sociology and an international authority on cults and coercion. She's a researcher, author, and educator who specializes in analysis of recruitment, indoctrination, and coercive methods of influence and control. Dr. Lalich is the author and co-author of 6 books, and her work has been translated into 12 different languages. In addition to working with survivors and families, she presents at domestic and international conferences and leads workshops for government agencies, international intelligence agencies, private companies, educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, and facilitates psychoeducational courses, workshops, and discussion groups for trauma survivors, families, and mental health professionals. She's also served as an expert witness in civil and criminal legal cases, and she's been featured in countless interviews, print, online, and podcasts, and appeared in numerous documentaries on cults and related subjects. She's also the founder and CEO of the nonprofit, the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion, which I will put a link to in the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Lalich.
Okay, so after hearing all that, you can probably understand why I'm trying to retire. Uh, I just turned 79 and I've been doing this work for about 35 years and whoa, it takes a toll. Um, anyway, that's not why we're here today. Um, so I'm gonna give some brief um, definitions and things, and then I'm hoping we can have this be a little bit interactive. I like when people ask questions or have something to say that we can get engaged with. So please feel free to do that. And I think maybe Geneva will keep track if people. Sounds like you switched to a different language. What does that mean? Confirm your language. Am I supposed to do this? You know, this technology. This is part of getting old. It's like, what?
I think that participants can choose what language
Oh,
they
I
would.
see. Okay,
Yeah.
because it said I was Japanese or something. But anyway, so hopefully that was in English and you understood me for those of you who understand English. So let me just begin with a little bit. I think a lot of you maybe are familiar with my work and how I got into this work, but I myself was in a cult for about 10 years in the 70s and 80s. It was a left-wing political cult, and I'm actually in the process of trying to finish up the draft of my memoir. So a lot of those old days are on my mind. So um, anyway, that's how I got into this work. I was in the cult for 10 years. I was 40 when I got out. I'd already been to college. I'd lived in other parts of the world. I was, pretty experienced. But when I got out, I was, as I said, I was 40. I felt like a 16-year-old. I was elated that I was out. It was like I felt like I was let out of prison, but I was also terrified. So for any of you who are cult survivors, you probably know what I'm talking about. I moved to New York and I had a job and I would go to work every day, but everything was just like freaky to me, like how to open a bank account and how to make friends. And I would go on business lunches and I wouldn't know what the hell to talk about because there I was in the cultural mecca of New York City, and I'd only seen like 3 movies in the last 10 years. So I didn't know what I was supposed to be talking about. Anyway, it was pretty traumatic. And, but I was very lucky. At the time, there was actually a cult clinic in New York. There was one in New York and one in Los Angeles, and they were sponsored by the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services. So the therapists there actually knew about cult after effects, which is one of the issues still today that we struggle with, people trying to find help. So that person, I have to say, saved my life. I had always been in leadership in my cult, and so I was really not a nice person, and I had hurt a lot of people. And so I've had a great deal of guilt and shame when I got out, and I was really suicidal for some time. And so I have to say that I thank Shelley for saving my life, because she got me to understand uh, why I did the things I did while I was in the cult. Um, anyway, after I felt better, I moved back to California and I eventually went to grad school. It took me about 10 years to decide to go to grad school. So I was 50. And so it's never too late for any of you who are thinking about that. And then I got hired at Chico State, one of the state universities here in California, and taught there for about 20 years. But before and in between and now after all that, I was very, very much involved with the various cult awareness networks that were going on at the time and doing my research and writing and things like that. So that's who I am. Right now, I live in Northern California. I'm a little bit freaked out about the fires up in Chico. And my colleagues and friends are safe, but there's, a lot of loss up there, including the giant ecological reserve that Chico State sponsors. Anyway, we're not here to talk about that either. So cults, what is a cult? There's a lot of controversy about the word cult, and I don't shy away from the word. I think we should use words that are meaningful and descriptive, and the word has been around a long time. It has definitions, it has meanings. Like I always say, we call a gang, so why can't we call a cult a cult? So my definition is that a cult is held together by a shared commitment to a authoritarian, charismatic leader. It upholds what I call a transcendent belief system that includes a recipe for personal transformation, and that it requires a high level of commitment in words and in deeds. So first, let me explain what I consider a transcendent belief system is a belief system that offers you the answer to everything, right? It explains the past, the present, and the future. It's the be all and end all. And that belief system is generally weaponized as one of the mechanisms to keep you involved with the group, so that you don't lose that promise of salvation, whatever that salvation might be in that particular group. And in terms of requiring a high level of commitment in words and deeds, that is done by setting up within the cult an indoctrination system. And that indoctrination system for me includes both influence and control. Well, and I'll go a little more into that as we go along. So any questions about any of that so far? We're all good? Yeah, okay. So there are, before I go more in depth, I want to just say there are some common myths about cults that still exist today. One is that cults went away after the 70s and cults aren't a problem anymore. I think that myth is less strong than it was in the past because of a lot of the things that have happened more recently in our country and in other countries, as well as there has been a great deal of media about cults in the past few years, and much of that is much better than it was in the past. It isn't just, focusing on the sexy stuff that they think viewers want to see or hear, but that they're really doing, some people anyway, and some journalists like Roberta are really doing much better work in going really in depth into what these organizations are about. Second myth is that only the young join cults. Now, that may have been true back in the 70s when a lot of cults were around in the hippie era and young people were joining and cults were very active on campus. But today, cults recruit actually primarily people in their 30s and 40s. Young people are still being recruited, but because cults have become so widespread, and especially because they have entered into the workplace, we see that people of all ages can be recruited into cults and are being recruited. The third one, which is one of the ones I love, which is the myth that only stupid, weird, crazy, lazy people join cults. Well, hopefully I can say I wasn't stupid, crazy, lazy. I mean, maybe I was weird, but in fact, what cults look for are people with high intelligence and people who have skills that they can contribute to the cult. So they look for professionals. They look for people who can recruit, who are involved in other social networks. They look for people who can bring in money, either their own or by contacts with other people. And cults certainly don't recruit lazy people, because the cult wants you to work for the cult, and you are going to work for the cult. Most cults are based on slave labor. So the last thing they want is lazy people. And they don't want sick people. I remember in my group, if somebody joined and they were a little bit off or they seemed unstable, we would tell that person to leave. We didn't want to take care of them. And there were stories back in the day about the Unification Church or the Moonies, for example. If somebody had a breakdown or wasn't well, they would literally just dump that person in front of a hospital and drive away. So no retirement plan, no retirement home. You can be sure of that. And of course, the fourth big myth is that all cults are religious. And once again, we know that's not true. Now, when I got out of my cult, which was in the mid 80s, really anything that I could find, which was very little, and all people really knew about were religious cults. But obviously, we know today that there is every kind of cult imaginable. One of my things that I always say is, if you're into chocolate chip cookies, I'll find you a chocolate chip cookie cult, right? So cults exist under any kind of ideology, any kind of belief system, has nothing to do with religion. So any questions about that? I saw there were some questions. Are you keeping track of those, Geneva?
Yes, I started a doc with a list of questions.
Okay, so we'll if something that I should answer right away comes up, let me know. Otherwise, maybe we'll take those later on. Does that make sense?
Yes, so far, no
Okay.
no clarifying questions on what you've said so far.
Okay, great. So the big thing about cults is conformity, right? You have to conform, right? You have to conform and comply. So how is that done? How is conformity and compliance achieved? Again, there are maybe 5 steps to that. The first, of course, is recruitment. First of all, they've got to get you in. And cult recruiters are generally very good at what they do. So one thing to know is that more than 2/3 of people who join cults are recruited by a friend, a family member, or a coworker, right? Now, why is that important? Why is that successful? Why? Because it's harder to say no to somebody you know, right? So somebody invites you to a workshop, or they invite you to see guru, blah, 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 who's coming to town and he's only coming this time and you better go this time. Or your coworker saying, oh, you've got to take this incredible workshop. Or maybe your boss is actually even ordering you to take a workshop. But because, yes, as someone's saying online, they build trust. Because it's someone you know and usually trust, inviting you to something for the first time, you'll go. And of course, once you go, the cult recruiters are there and they know exactly what to do. They know who to spot, who looks vulnerable, how can they, what we say, love bomb you, surround you with goodness and light and tell you how wonderful you are and do all these wonderful things for you and ask you to come back. And then because they've been so nice to you, you feel so obligated. You say, okay, I'll come back the next time, whatever. That's kind of how it goes, right? So the first stage is recruitment. Secondly is, as I mentioned earlier, the indoctrination program, right? Which I'll talk a little bit more about. So remember, we're going over the 5 points of how is conformity and compliance achieved. The third is getting you to change. Remember, I said that one of the factors or facets of the belief system is that you have to go through a personal transformation, right? You're not good as you are, right? They don't accept you. You have to change. You have to become this other person in order to be accepted within the group and to stay on the path. So that change process is the third part of the indoctrination. Fourth is the constant reinforcement, right? You don't just get brainwashed once and then it's all over, right? But they keep having to do things to keep you there, right? So they'll put you through trials and tests and have you do something maybe you don't really want to do, but then they get you to do it. Aha, it's one more time. You've given yourself up, right? So that reinforcement goes on all throughout your membership in the group. And the final stage of the indoctrination is that you become enveloped in what I call a closed loop or a self-sealing system. right? We're talking about a social system, right? So you're in this closed world, a closed reality. You really are in an alternate reality. You know, I was just writing or going over my memoir, and there's one part which is, I think, is a perfect example of living in this altered reality. I had recruited, unfortunately, my best friend into the cult. Her name was Polly. And um, at one point, and Polly was an attorney, and we were roommates at that time. And her mother wanted to come visit, and she was given permission to let her mother come and visit, in part because Polly was an attorney, so she was valuable to the organization. And at this point, we were still pretty young. This was like in the first few years, early years. When we joined the cult, we all had to choose different names, right? Like my name in the cult was Emma. I was Comrade Emma. And Polly's name was Lillian. She was Comrade Lillian. Once you joined, the very day you joined, you had to pick a name, only a first name. And that was how everybody was to know you. And you were never to tell anybody your real name. You had to have your mail sent to a different address so your roommates didn't see your name. You never talked about your past. So nobody was supposed to know who anybody was. And that was supposedly a security mechanism. Like if you got caught by the FBI, you couldn't give up anybody else because you didn't know anybody's names. Anyway, so the idea was we were to always use our party names and never our real names. Well, Polly's mother arrived, and while she was staying with us for the week or whatever it was, Polly would call me Yanya. She would refer to me as Yanya, you know, when we were with her mom. Now, her mom knew me before we got into this group. So she obviously knew me as Yanya. So it would have been completely insane for Polly to suddenly be calling me Emma in front of her mother, right? Her mother would have thought, well, why are you calling her Emma? Her name's Yanya. But after her mother left, I wrote a security report and turned in Polly and said that she committed a security breach by using my real name while her mother was visiting. Now, talk about cuckoo, right? I mean, that was total nonsense, right? Like, but I was following the rules of the organization. It didn't matter that it would have been nonsense, right? I was going by what I was supposed to do. And of course, Polly was then at the next meeting criticized and raked over the coals and the whole bit. And I thought I had done the right thing. I was in a closed world. So that's what I mean about the self-sealing system, the closed world, the altered reality. And it's interesting to me now when I look back at that, like obviously we had, and probably most cult people in cults don't have a clue really how you're looked at from the outside, like how crazy it is, how crazy it seems to outsiders. Okay, so let's go over a little bit. I think we've talked about recruitment. Recruitment is, the purpose is to get you to go along, to get you to come back, to get you to go along, and to get you to think it's special, right? And so here's this issue of charisma, right? Raving about the leader, saying how, you're going to come to this event and guru, blah, 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 is going to lift himself off the chair and there's going to be a yellow light around him, right? And they prime you to expect all these things when you go to that first meeting. So even if you don't see guru, blah, 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 lift off the chair and have a yellow light, everyone else does. So you think, oh yeah, that was cool, right? Because you go along, when in Rome, you go along, you say, oh yeah, that was cool. Or some people will say, that's bogus and I'm out of here. But those of you who go and go along with it because it's the cool group thing to do, you're going to be taken to the next step. The other thing that happens in recruitment is a lot of what I call a manufactured environment. Things aren't really what they seem, right? So for example, I'll give you another example from the group I was in. As I said, we were a left-wing political cult. And so we wanted to recruit workers, right? And we were supposed to all be workers or dress like workers and, And we would have at Thanksgiving, we would put on these dinners, right? We would order like, 15 turkeys, and we'd schedule these big events. And supposedly everybody who worked at a job was supposed to invite their work colleagues to come to this Thanksgiving dinner. Well, we were lucky if one worker ever came. I mean, we got to eat a lot of turkey on those days, but when people came, of course, we all pretended that we were these working class people, and we worked in this factory or that factory, and we completely put on a front. It was a complete manufactured environment. It wasn't at all what it was supposed to be. So that's recruitment. And I guess while I'm on recruitment, I want to say a little bit about charisma. Most people don't understand charisma and what charisma is. Most people think that somebody is born with the trait, with charisma is inborn, right? Like, oh, this kid is so charismatic, or oh, my young son, he's so handsome and charismatic. And so we get this idea that charisma is something inherent in the person. No. Charisma is actually a social relationship. And this was first described by a sociologist, a German sociologist, Geneva, who's in Germany, named Max Weber, Weber. And among other things that he wrote about charisma. Charisma is a social relationship, meaning that you are the person, it's you who attributes charisma to someone else, right? You think that person is charismatic. And that's why some people could think Bill Clinton was charismatic, and other people thought he was just a grubby sexual pervert, right? Or some people think, I suppose, that Donald Trump is charismatic, and other people are like, ew, weird, right? So charisma is a social relationship. You honor that person with charisma. And so what does that mean? That means once you do that, once you decide that someone else is charismatic, that means, in a sense, that they have power over you. So this immediately sets up an imbalance of power, which is a lot of what cults are about, right? These are power relationships. These are abuses of power, right? So I just wanted to mention that about charisma because it does come up all the time. Okay, so we talked about indoctrination. Every group is going to have some indoctrination program. It could be more formal, it could be informal. It could be actual classes or Bible study, or, we had what we called party school, and we had manuals that we studied to learn how to be good communists. Or it can be more informal. But basically what happens through the indoctrination is you have ordinary persuasion techniques. Nothing unusual, right? These are all things that we have responded to throughout life, right? Guilt, anxiety, fear, peer pressure, right? These are all things, there's nothing unusual. Very, very, I used to get calls all the time from parents saying, oh, my daughter's in a cult and her eyes look weird and I think they're giving her drugs. No, very, very few cults actually use drugs. They don't need to. They're using basic social psychological influence techniques, right? The few cults who did use drugs, Charlie Manson, Jim Jones, not only did a lot of drugs himself, but he used to put people who were feisty would get put in this special building on the compound in Jonestown and be drugged and kept away from everyone else. But and the other one was Aum Shinrikyo, the Japanese cult leader. They let the sarin gas in the subway back in the 90s. Some of you may know about that one. He used to give some of his followers LSD and lock them in a cage, things like, but that's unusual. Most cults don't do that, and they don't have to do that. One of the big influence techniques, as I mentioned just a minute ago, is peer pressure, right? After we reach a certain age, we respond more to our peers than, say, our adults, like our parents or other professionals, right? peer pressure is incredibly important, right? We all try to get along, want to get along, do what our friends are doing, right? I think that's why cults are groups, actually, is because of this peer pressure thing. They got to have that. Although there are one-on-one cults. And of course, there is the promise of salvation, as I mentioned earlier, which could be anything, could be money, could be weight loss, could be, you know, ascending to some higher level, whatever that might be, Armageddon, being saved. And then, of course, there is this idea that you have become part of a new family. This is now your family. And of course, family is another one of those things that carries a lot of weight with us. So that's what's happening on the individual level through indoctrination, right? How it's done by the cult or by the group is through coercive processes, right? The education, the directed education, whether it's classes, whether it's Bible study, whether it's sitting around in circles and criticizing each other, whatever it might be, there's this directed education of training and teaching. The most important part of it is what I call the attack on the self, right? What they need to do is take apart yourself because they want to remold you or reframe you into a new self, into the cult self. So by the attack on self, I mean the attack on your self-worth, your self-trust, your self-confidence, right? Those things are torn apart. Through this indoctrination program, you're basically taught that everything you knew or did before was garbage, right? And that you have to start all over, that you are a completely worthless human being, and only we can save you and shape you into, this new elite person who's going to do whatever it is. So taking apart yourself is the most important part of getting you to eventually become a true believer. And so they do that by convincing you that you are uninformed, right? And this is why questions are always turned back on you. When you ask questions, this is important during the recruitment process, right? You ask questions, the question's going to get turned back on you, right? They're either going to say, oh, you don't know enough yet to ask that question. Like, take another course, then ask us the question. Of course, by then you forgot the question, right? Or they actually, in some cases, may criticize you for, how dare you ask that question? Are you questioning the leader's knowledge, et cetera, right? So they convince you that you're uninformed and only they can inform you and teach you how to be who you want to be. And of course, within that, there is a lot of manipulation. All of this is a giant manipulation. And again, that'll vary in different groups, how that's done, whether it's as a new member, maybe you have somebody who's assigned to you, like in our group, we had what were called one helps, and your one help was this person who you could go to with your questions, right? And they were going to help you understand, right? As you were a new member. Of course, what the one help did was report back to the leader, oh, so-and-so's having hesitations about this. And then they knew what to criticize you for next time, right? So they may have something like that. So then you go through, all of this is to get you to go through this change process, right? So that your view of yourself and your view of the world changes, right? You take on a new worldview, you take on new attitudes, you take on new behaviors. And as you behave in the way that's expected, you are praised. And if you revert back to old behaviors, then you're criticized and you have to go through some punishment or something to get back on track. So it's a new worldview, it's new attitudes, new behaviors, and you start to shift from your pre-cult self to this person that they want you to be, right? So your identity is shifting, your interests are changing, you're giving up things you used to do before, you don't do them anymore, you're giving up your old friends, you're getting more and more enveloped in this closed world. Now, I just want to make one point here. Obviously, this doesn't apply to kids who are born in cults. Kids who are born in cults don't have a pre-cult self. They only have the self that got molded by the cult to begin with. So when kids get out of cults, and many, many, many are leaving, and this is a huge issue right now and has been for some years, of people who were born in cults leaving. And in many cases, they get out in the world and they have no clue what to do, depending on how sequestered their group was, right? And if they were homeschooled, they get out in the world, sometimes they don't even know their real name. They don't have a birth certificate. They don't know about getting a GED, which is the high school equivalency here in the United States. They don't know how to drive. They don't, they don't know how to do a resume. They don't know anything. They maybe have never even touched a computer. Who knows, right? And so it's a very, very, very difficult recovery process for kids coming out of cults. And I consider it the number one public health issue in our country and in many other countries that no one is talking about, because they have nowhere to go. It doesn't matter what age they are. If they go to a domestic violence shelter, they get turned away because they don't qualify, right? So as a society, we have no resources for these people when they come out. And they end up living on the streets. They end up doing drugs. They end up selling themselves for sex. They end up massive number of suicides. And so that is a whole other separate issue. And I discuss this somewhat in my book, Escaping Utopia, where I interviewed 65 individuals who were born and raised in cults. Anyway, I just wanted to make that clarification. So then we have, as I said, the reinforcement that goes on as you're a member of the group, reinforcing the indoctrination, right? You'll be put through tests and crises, as I mentioned earlier. Like, for example, in the Unification Church, one of the first things they had you do was call up your parents and cut off from them. Or sometimes they have you write a letter to your family, cutting off from them, right? That's a test, right? And if you do it, you're that much in deeper, right? So they'll put you through tests and crises until you are more and more dependent on the group. And the motto, I always say the motto is, it's maybe never said out loud, but the motto is alter the self or perish, right? You have to go through the program or you're done for, right? Either literally or metaphorically. So once you are enmeshed in this self-sealing system, you believe that the leader is all good and has all the truth. You believe that you're part of an elite with special knowledge. You have to continue to deny yourself to be fully part of the group. Members are to blame for whatever goes wrong. The leader is responsible for whatever goes right, and everything else is evil. And that's kind of a short and quick thing. And so for those who become the true believer, the truly devoted member, and not everyone may reach that level. There are going to be levels of commitment and levels of membership within every group. But those who become the true believers become what we call, or what I call, a deployable agent. And what that means is the cult can tell you to do whatever it wants you to do, and you're going to do it, and you're not going to question it. You're like a Marine, right? So, and I'll give you another personal example of that. This is one I was just writing about in my memoir. At some point, I was told, the leader called me up at 3 a.m. She was drunk, and she's like, "Comrade Emma, I want you to build me a publishing house. I want you to build the best goddamn publishing house in the country or in the world." Blah, blah, blah. So I built a publishing house. I didn't know the first thing about it, but I learned, and I built a actually pretty cool publishing house that we had, and we published books and we published journals, and I would go to the various book fairs. I was just telling Geneva that I went to the Frankfurt Book Fair. Anyway, at one point, she said to me, "I want you to go to New York and ask so-and-so to give us $1 million," or whatever the equivalent of $1 million was back in the early 80s. So this was one of my main publishing contacts, a very important person. And I thought to myself, oh my Jesus God, I cannot go and ask him for $1 million. This is just going to be so embarrassing. I mean, I literally thought that at the time, but of course I went. Of course I went. I went to New York. We had a nice lunch at a cafe outside of a restaurant. I was so nervous. I asked him for the $1 million. He looked at me like I was completely nuts. Of course, he declined. And I flew back home and I thought, oh man, I'm really going to get in trouble because I didn't get the $1 million. No. What happened? This is black is white and white is black. This is the black is white, white is black thinking. What happened? I got home and I was put on trial. We used to put people on trial, like the fake Russian trials, right? And you'd be sitting in a chair in front of maybe 40 people, right? And you'd be sitting like in a director's chair, but high up, and you would get criticized, right? When you were on trial, and then you could get expelled, you could get whatever. I was put on trial for going to New York and asking Mr. So-and-so for $1 million, which is what I was told to do. Now, could I sit there and say, wait a minute, you got this wrong. That's what I was told to do. No, of course not. I just sat there and took it. I took whatever many hours it was of people yelling at me, screaming at me, swearing at me, calling me names, whatever, what a traitor to the party I was and how the cause was going to fall apart because of me. And I was a capitalist running dog and all the things that we called people in our group. And I took it, right? So this is what happens when you're a devoted member, a true believer, a deployable agent. You do whatever it is you're asked to do, and you try not to think about it. And that's what happens when you leave. This is where what we call the moral injury comes from, right? Yes, we all leave and have complex PTSD, and some of us have a great deal of what's also called moral injury, meaning the things we did while we were in the group or the things that we saw being done that we couldn't do anything about, that we have enormous guilt and shame about. So hopefully this helps those on the outside, and hopefully some of you understand why people in cults do the things that they do that seem completely incomprehensible to people on the outside, right? Why did the people at Jonestown drink the Kool-Aid? Well, Annie can tell us about that. She wrote a book about that. Why did the 39 followers in Heaven's Gate commit collective suicide? Why does someone kill their own child or watch their own child be beaten? Hopefully we can understand once you're in this trapped reality and once you have accepted these belief systems, you have what I then call bounded choice, right? Because this issue of free will comes up all the time. Do we have free will? I think that's a religious issue, actually, but y'all can probably talk about that. But bounded choice is when your choices are constrained and confined by the will of the group, right? You know exactly what you have to do to not lose everything that you have just given your life for. You know that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, or if you question the leader, or if you disobey or do something wrong or decide to leave, you're going to die in some way. You're going to lose everything. You're going to lose your salvation. You could lose your family. You're going to lose all your connection. You're going to lose, boom, you're done, right? So you choose for the group. You choose for the leader. You are now functioning under the will of the leader, right? So your free will has been altered and adapted to be the will and what I say, the immorality of the cult leader. And that's why we do the things we do. Until one day, hopefully, that moment comes when you can say, I'm out, I'm getting out. And that's usually a process. And the metaphor that I use is the shelf. And some of you have maybe heard me talk about this on a podcast or something, but I believe that even true believers, because I know this was true for myself, you do question things. You do go, whoa, that's a bit much. Hmm. Mm. Of course, you can't say anything. There's no one you can talk to because what you'll get turned in like my good friend Polly, right? So you have these things. And what do you do with them? You store them in the back of your head on the shelf in the back of your brain. You store them, store them, store them until one day, one thing too much happens and that shelf breaks. Once that shelf breaks, you may not know you're in a cult. You may not say, oh God, I'm in a cult. I got to get out of here. But you know something's wrong. You know that you're not in something that's for your best interest. You know that there's something not right there. And then if you're lucky, you can work your way out. And working your way out is never easy, never easy. So I think I'm going to end. Let's see what time it is. Oh dear, I've talked too much. I'm going to end here and take some of the questions if that's okay. Do you want to sort through them, Geneva?
Sure, yeah, I've been keeping it. There's a lot of them.
Yeah,
Um,
just kind of.
so there were two questions that were basically the same about cults in the workplace,
Mhm.
and have cults entered the workforce? And I think this is also kind of connected. There were several comments about the multi-level marketing schemes,
Mhm.
and whether or not you would consider that to be a cult and what the
Okay.
significant differences are.
Okay, so cults entered the workplace primarily through what those of us in the field call LGATs, large group awareness trainings. So back in the day, and we still have them, we had EST, LifeSpring, SciWorld, this one, that one, this one, that one. And they just grew exponentially, right? They started probably in the late 60s, early 70s, and now they are everywhere. And they're in, and many workplaces send their people to these. The government has used these, and they aren't necessarily called excuse me, they aren't necessarily cults, but they certainly use cultic techniques. And some of them are cults at the top, at the leadership level. So that's one way, probably the main way that cults got into the workplace. Multi-level marketing schemes are terrible. They're not all cults. Certainly some of them are. Certainly some of the very well-known ones that have been around forever, uh, whose names I shall not say, but one starts with an A and one starts with an H. And I think this is something Roberta's interested in, I believe. No, the multi-level marketing scams use the same type of techniques and are extremely cultic. If anything, they are financially fraudulent. They certainly take advantage of people and exploit them both financially and personally. Um, there was that wonderful documentary about the people who made those clothes, Lulu something. Um, yeah, so they're there for sure. They're there for sure. I don't know if that answers it. Next, Lululemon.
Lululemon, I think it is. Yeah.
Lulu-
Um,
Lululemon. Oh God, those people.
yeah. On that same thread, there was also a question of whether, regarding like high pressure sales tactics, whether who is learning from who, whether they're being informed by cults or they're informing cults.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but like I said, what's used in cults are basic social psychology, basic influence techniques. There's a wonderful book by Robert Cialdini, Cialdini. Robert Cialdini. He was a professor at Arizona State, I think. He may be retired now, but he wrote a wonderful book called Influence. And he talks about the 8 criteria of influence, and how these get used in sales and also in cults. I actually Herbalife. Thank you. I actually met him when he spoke at one of the cult conferences way back in the day. So that's a great book for better understanding these tactics that sales companies also use. Okay, next.
Sorry, there are a lot coming in chat right now. Trying to keep up. Let's see.
Lu-
What is the
Let me
prime?
just say, Lulu Rich, I think, was the documentary. Lululemon is the one that sells those yoga clothes, right? Although there's question.
Yeah, I think they're saying that, yeah, there's a distinction.
Yeah, but I would be careful about that distinction. But I'm not going to say anything. But the documentary was Lulu Rich, and it was this couple who sold these clothes. Okay, go on. I'm sorry, Geneva.
Okay. There was a question. What is the prime directive of the cult leader? Is it about power and money or narcissism? And is there no conscience for the families or children they harm?
Okay, so most cult leaders are narcissists, and some of them are malignant narcissists, which means the really bad ones, the ones that are a little bit psychopathic, and that's where the bad stuff really happens. Um, Cult leaders are about money, sex, or power, or some combination thereof. And it's going to depend with every cult. You know, you had Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his 93 Rolls Royces, right? For him, it was money. It was also sex. Of course, it's always about power. Power is there no matter what. And for the most part, these are intensely corrupt individuals who have no feelings for other people. They do not have empathy. It's all about them. It's all about the self. And it's in that sense, they are all narcissists. And someone asked me this on Instagram or somewhere the other day. I have never known a cult leader to apologize if they got caught out, like having sex or whatever. I mean, I've been in enough trials as expert witness. No, they'll never apologize.
Okay, let's see. Why do you think cults were so popular in the 70s?
In the 70s, because, whoa, the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, that was the era of personal transformation, right? That's when, you know, we had the hippie movement and people checking out new things and wanting to not, you know, go along with their middle class parents, bourgeois attitudes and, you know, white picket fences and all of that. And so it was a time when people were exploring. And so this was a perfect time for cults to recruit. The other thing that happened was in the late 60s, I think it was 68 or 69, America changed its immigration policy. Before then, it was very difficult to come to America if you were Asian, which was left over from World War II and our hatred for the Japanese at that time. And then the Cold War of the 50s and our hatred for China at that time, of the communist China. But then in the late 60s, we changed the immigration policy. And what happened? Indian gurus came over here in droves, right? Because they had a completely susceptible populace to recruit from. You had Westerners who didn't have a clue about Indian culture or Indian religions. And so these shady gurus came over to take advantage of a vulnerable population. So that's another reason it exploded in the 70s.
Let's see. Do cults have any weaknesses that can be exploited in their disadvantage?
Well, the weaknesses are, you know, sometimes the leader goes too far. Um, and and I mean, I guess that a weakness in a sense is when they really do engage in criminal behavior, because that's when they can be held accountable. So then if you have people who have left who are going to file criminal charges, as happened with Keith Raniere and Nexium, as is happening with Joaquin Nassan, the apostle of La Luz del Mundo, the horrible, horrible, horrible church evangelist in Mexico. Um, when there are actual crimes and they can be held accountable, that's when we can nail them. You know, that's when we can get them convicted. Yes, Nixium was also an MLM and an LGOT. It was a little bit of everything. But yeah, I'd say the weaknesses are only if the cult leader doesn't set up a good enough internal structure, because cult leaders are pretty lazy. They don't do much, right? So they need to set up a good structure of lieutenants who make everything happen, right? Who carry out their word, who recruit, who set up the satellite offices, all of that. So if a cult leader isn't savvy in that sense to set up a good infrastructure, then it's more likely to go belly up.
Okay, let's see. Do you feel cults are more nuanced now with the infiltration into corporate America? Not just one person at the top, but becoming powerful systems.
Well, there are always systems, and in many ways, there can be more than one person at the top. I mean, take for example the Jehovah's Witnesses, where they have the elders and the governing, whatever they're called, the governing body. Because I get asked that all the time. Well, there's not one charismatic leader. The cults that have been around a long time, obviously the original leader is going to die, and so the people who carry on have what we call charisma by proxy, right? They're carrying on the beliefs and the practices and the systems of the original leader. What was the question? I'm sorry.
I'll read it one more time.
Or are they more nuanced? I don't know that they're more nuanced. I mean, it's hard for me because I always can spot them. Certainly, one of the biggest changes is internet-based cults, and that was a huge change that happened because of the pandemic. And that's when, I left Chico State. I thought I was going to retire. I moved to a different town and across the bridge from San Francisco. I started writing my memoir. Oh, I'm going to retire. And then what happened? All these people started falling down rabbit holes, right? Because everybody was spending all their time on the computer because they couldn't go out and they were alone or they didn't see people. And then suddenly I'm getting hundreds of emails. My aunt this, my uncle that. Who do I invite to Thanksgiving dinner? I don't know how to talk to this one. My sister, who was always so smart, now believes these conspiracy theories. And then the anti-vaxxers. So we had QAnon, right? Big thing, QAnon. Who was the leader of QAnon? Was it that man and his son? Who was the leader of the anti-vaxxer movement? Was it Alex Jones? Was it this one? Was it that one? It became very difficult for those of us who for years had been identifying what I now call the run-of-the-mill brick and mortar cults, right? You always knew where the cult was. You always knew who the leader was. You knew who the satellites were. Suddenly you've got this amorphous shit happening on the internet. Like, whoa, what is this? And so that has somewhat changed the landscape, because I always thought for many years you had to have that personal contact in order to get recruited. But the internet changed all that. That sense of community, that sense of family could happen in the same way over the internet and draw people in. And so that was a big change.
Okay. How old were you when you got involved with the cult?
30. I was 30. I should have known better. You'll read about it in my memoir if it ever comes out.
Should children born into cults be accepted into the foster care system or supported by children's advocacy agencies?
Well, children born, it depends on when they leave and how old they are. I mean, the foster care system has its own problems, so I'm not sure that's where we should send them. What we really need are therapists, social workers, EMTs, all kinds of frontline professionals trained to understand when someone's in a cult, what the after effects are, what the symptoms are, what the red flags are, so that if you're an EMT driver and you've got someone in your ambulance, there's things you could do or say or ask to decide, oh, this person. And who did very, very good with that were the people fighting human trafficking, right? They did massive education of airline stewardesses, or whatever they're called now, airline attendants. They did massive education of hospitals and police forces so that human trafficking was recognizable, right? And those the cultiverse, if we want to call that, or the professionals in the cultiverse, we haven't had the same success in being able to educate the public. And in part, that's because, for example, it's so bloody difficult to get into the schools and talk about cults. Why? Because they think you're going to talk about religion and they think you're going to offend somebody. So try to get into a high school and talk about cults, practically impossible. So we need, massive public education about the risks, and then we need resources for people coming out. So they have places they can go. They have people who will help them with, resumes. Like I said earlier, people probably don't even do resumes anymore. I'm too old to know how to apply for a job. But anyway, you know what I'm saying. So I don't think it's just one thing like, okay, we're going to send, someone 17 and they escape finally, and they, get from Turkey to America, which was the case with someone that I interviewed for my book, right? And then what? Where do they go? What do they do? So it's huge. It's a huge issue. I don't have answers for that one. I'm sorry. How are we doing on time?
We are at
12:03, according to my Fitbit.
depending on what time zone you're in. Okay, I'm getting really bombarded with questions. I was told to check the YouTube channel because apparently there are questions coming in there too.
Yeah.
I do see one here. How does a collective of caring and collaborative people prevent becoming a cult toxic as they grow in numbers and intentional actions?
Well, a healthy organization is going to have transparency, right? They're going to say how the money comes in. They're going to say what happens to the money. They're going to publish financial reports. They're going to accept criticism of the leadership. They're going to have democratic ways that people are chosen for leadership positions. The all the things that we might recognize in a healthy organization is, if this is a new group and it's growing, this is something that should be looked at. There was a great guy I think he was from Australia, who wrote a book called Let's Talk Culture, who talks about, what are the ways to make your organization safe and viable. So yeah, you want to make sure that, one person doesn't have all the power, one person doesn't have all the say so, one person isn't, God. And you want democracy and transparency, and you have to build that into the structure of your organization.
Okay. Let's see. Was there anything you can point to that made you vulnerable at the age of 30?
Well, yeah, I was vulnerable because I was new in town. I was coming out as a lesbian, which, even though I was in San Francisco and I was living in the Castro district, which was the gay mecca, it was still a huge thing for me at age 30, coming from a very Eastern European patriarchal family back in the day. And so I was vulnerable for that. I was vulnerable because I was new in town. And I was someone who was always interested in social justice and equality. And so I just happened to meet some people, got invited to the first thing, and it went from there. I think being 30, I felt like it was time for me to put my money where my mouth was. I had been a hippie. I had lived on an island in Spain for 4 years. I'd done this and I'd done that. And this group came along and said, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to have the revolution. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm on, I'll devote my life. I'll give up my friends and my time and my this and my that. And so boom, there I was.
Okay. So how much more time do you have? I just want to
Maybe of course, of control laws. Yeah. Why don't we go till 12:15? I don't know if there's any way well, no, if you send me the questions, I can't, I don't have the time to answer them. I'm sorry.
it's
I'm so stressed all the time. So,
no, it's okay. It's an overwhelming amount of questions. There is one that I want to particularly address. I'm seeing here a question about whether you have a spiritual background yourself. I don't get the impression you have mentioned a few religions here, and we don't obviously as the Interfaith Center don't want to offend anyone.
right.
Um, So I think it would be helpful if you could clarify, the distinction between legitimate religious and spiritual affiliations um,
And a
cults
cult.
that use religion as a mechanism of coercion.
Okay, so first of all, my own background, I grew up Serbian Orthodox. My parents were Serbians. We went to the church. I didn't understand a word of it because it was in Serbian, and I didn't want to speak Serbian. I wanted to be American. So I sat in church and smelled the incense and the lamb that was roasting out in the barbecue pits for our picnic afterwards. I love the pageantry. I love the singing. I love, all of that, but it didn't really speak to me in a deep sense. I was never ever really religious. I was always of a more political side to me, although I never had anything against religion. It just was never for me. In terms of the difference between cults and a healthy religion, here's how I see it. A healthy religion is not going to have you praying to the person in front of you. In a healthy religion, you are honoring and believing in and perhaps praying to some higher spirit, higher being, higher entity. And whether that's God or Buddha or a tree or whatever, you're not being controlled and led by this guy or woman in front of you who's telling you what to do and how to live, right? You also, in a healthy religion, will not have shunning. If you decide to leave that church and go somewhere else, you shouldn't lose all your friends or have people stop talking to you or say bad things about you, right? So shunning, I think, is another criteria of what would be a much more cultic religion than a healthy one. I mean, those are just a few examples. A healthy religion is not going to control every aspect of your life. They may have guidelines to live by. They may say, when someone moves into your neighborhood, bake them some cookies and take them over and introduce yourself and say hi. I don't know if people still do that. They did that when I was a kid, but they don't check up on you and say, did you take cookies to your neighbors, right? Your church may tell you, or your religion may tell you, you cannot use birth control, but they aren't coming into your bedroom to check if you're using birth control, right? So there may be some religions that are more strict and have more discipline and maybe more rules to live by than some other religions that may be more loosey-goosey, but they aren't necessarily a cult just because they have some rules and regulations, right? So I think that to me is one of the main differences. Does that help? Does that clarify for people? Cults are not about religion. Remember, cults are not about religion. There are cults that call themselves religion. There are religious cults, but that's not the only kind. Cults are not about religion. They're about extreme ideologies, extreme belief systems, and methods of influence and control that confine a person and get them to do their bidding without thinking. Does that
Thank
make
you.
sense?
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. And I mean, we get comments all the time when we're advertising, our programming about different religions that are just calling them all cults. And so I think it's very helpful for you to share that. So I think we might have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
Um, let's see. Here's one from someone who feels that they left a cult. They're a survivor and they need help and they're asking if you have workshops or support groups that you can recommend.
Right. At the moment, I'm not doing any courses. We are offering in September a music workshop. It'll be 4 sessions and it'll be led by a music therapist from New York who works with gang members, both in detention centers and in prisons. He's fantastic. He did a workshop for us a couple of years ago and it was hugely successful. The registration button for that should be on our website by Monday, I hope, if not the day after. So that'll be for 4 Mondays in September. I don't have any discussion groups going right now. There are some people who are doing discussion groups. Some are for people born and raised in a cult. I am not at the moment doing any individual or family consultations. As I said, I am really trying to let go and hope that other people are going to rise to the occasion. There is an organization called the Freedom Train Project. The Freedom Train Project. It's a charity based in LA. And Tabby Chapman, who was a member of NXIVM, is the founder of that. And she has a list of therapists around the country that she has vetted, so to speak. I cannot endorse anyone on that list, but that is one place, if you need help, you could contact Tabby at the Freedom Train Project and see if there is someone in your state who could help you if you want to go that route. The best thing you can do if you're a survivor is get my book. I'm sorry to promote my book, but it is really helpful. It's called Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships. It's in its third edition, and it's been extremely helpful for people since the mid-90s. I'm coming out with a Spanish version soon, and also a workbook to go along with it. So that's also one resource. There are a lot of articles and other kinds of resources like reading lists, etc., both on the Lalich Center website and on my personal website, yanyalalich.com. So that's another place. There's a checklist for what to look for in a therapist, things like that.
And is all of that information available at the lalichcenter.org website?
Yeah, the lalichcenter.org or yanyalalich.com.
Okay. I have put that in the chat. So I think just one more question and then we'll wrap up. So there's a question about what are the legitimate needs that people have, such as the need to belong or to feel special, that they maybe feel are not being met outside of cultdoms, and how can they find that somewhere else in the world?
Okay, so 2 parts to that answer. One is, I get asked all the time, is there a certain personality type that gets recruited into a cult? No. If there is any common denominator, it's idealism. It's people who want to make a better world, people who want to have a better life, a better religion, a better whatever, right? It's idealism. That's one thing. The other thing is, I do believe that as the world has become more complex, people very naturally look for a framework for understanding the world, right? On top of the fact that we are social animals, right? We like to be with other people. We tend to gravitate toward other people, toward groups, families, etc., right? So you put all that together, you've got a complex society, you've got the sense of idealism, you've got this a sense of wanting to be part of something, wanting to make something of your life, right? There's a thing they used to say, I don't know if they're saying it as much, but back in the day, it was always like, oh, it's those seekers, right? It's those seekers who are joining cults. We are all seekers, right? We are all looking for meaning and purpose and a sense of the world, right? And of our life, whether it's on a small scale or a large scale. And so these are all the things that cults will prey on, right? And it's been shown, for example, when a society is in disarray, for example, when the Iron Curtain fell, when the Soviet Union split up, you had all these countries, like the rug was ripped out from under them. Like, what the hell were they supposed to believe in now? They had been living in this incredibly controlled system, the communist system, right? And so there they were all at odds, right? And the cults, many, many cults just went there in droves and recruited like crazy, because here were people who were kind of at a loss. Like, what do we do? Where do we go now? And that's what happened during the pandemic. That's why when there's an earthquake, who goes to help? The Scientologists in their little yellow vests or whatever color vests they wear, right? Because they know that's good recruiting ground, right? People are vulnerable. Well, we all get vulnerable a million times in our lives, right? Being vulnerable isn't a sickness. You're vulnerable if your dog just died. You're vulnerable if it's raining outside. You're vulnerable if you're new in town. You're vulnerable if you started a new job. You just got divorced, right? A million times in our lives, we're vulnerable. If at that moment, something or someone comes along, it just takes one step and they know how to draw you in. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lalich. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time. It is now, 18 after. So we said we would go till 15 after. And again, the recording will be available online, and I will send that out to anyone who's interested. So thank you all for your participation. And I mean, for all of the questions, I'm so sorry we didn't get to all of them, but check out Dr. Lalich's book and website, and hopefully maybe some of your questions can be answered there. And so everyone, thank you. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if I could just thank Geneva for setting this up. She chased me for several months to get this scheduled. And I so appreciate being here, and for all of you to come and spend your Sunday. I guess for you it's afternoon. Well, for me it's afternoon at this point. And I appreciated all of your questions and your attention. And thank you for supporting my work. And stay away from those cults.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I mean, and this is the second time that Dr. Lalich has been with us. So there's another talk from her on our YouTube channel that I encourage you to revisit. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. We have so many time zones here. So have a good night.
Ciao, everybody. Bye.